So here we are again. This week is going to be interesting. We're going to look at, this is the outbreak of the American Revolution. And last lecture, we learned about the French and Indian War and the causes and consequences of the French and Indian War. And we also noticed that the British were a little bit nonplussed about the fact that they had to pay for this particular war. They took on an awful lot of debt. So what the British are going to end up doing is they are going to implement policies on the colonies in order to pay off some of that debt and in order to justify a continued presence in the colonies. So today we are going to talk about those post-war British policies and the consequences of those policies. So let's get started. Uh-oh. There we go. Alright, so the essential question that we're going to be dealing with here is we're going to analyze the reasons for the change in British policies toward the American colonies and the consequences of those changes. And this is going to deal with key concepts 2.3.2 and 3.1.2 in your AP guide. So, what were these British policies and why were these British policies put into place? Things had been going so well for so long. The idea of that, yeah, so long as the colonies are making money, there's really no reason to interfere in how they do business. Well, now the British government is actually having to spend money to protect and defend these colonies. A tremendous amount of money was spent on the 7 Years' War. There's a continued British military presence in North America to keep the Americans safe. So Britain is seeing, hey, look, we have an increase in our debt. We have to pay that debt off, which means raising taxes. We have to raise taxes. We have to raise money to pay off this debt. We also see that for the first time, significant numbers of British soldiers are going to be kept in the Americas, and there's going to be a tremendous amount of conflict between these British regular soldiers and North American militia. We also see increased differences that are becoming apparent between the American colonists and Britain. We especially see this with the Proclamation Line of 1763, where colonial interests were, let's go into the Ohio Valley and use that land and farm that land. Whereas the British interests are, hey, look, we really don't want to deal with all the fighting and stuff that's going to take place if you do that. So we're going to draw this line. We also see differences that are happening between British soldiers. The British soldiers looking down on American militia. American militia looking at the British regulars as being aloof and effete. So what we are going to end up seeing here is a perfect example of what we would call a conflict cycle. Now, in counseling, a conflict cycle is when two individuals engage in a conflict and each person's actions escalates the actions of the other, which then escalates the actions of the other. And it's very similar to what we're going to see here. So what we're going to see is British policy is going to be implemented. They're going to implement taxes. They're going to implement enforcement measures to collect those taxes. And the consequence of those taxes is going to be American resistance to those policies. Now, instead of the Americans and the British coming together and saying, hey, look, this is the situation, we need to resolve this, no, instead, England is going to say, hey, we are the powerful country. We are the mother country. You are our colony. You have to do what we tell you to do. That's how it works. And in fact, the Americans are like, no, we really don't think so. So what will ultimately end up happening is even more harsh policy measures are going to be put into effect to try to make the American colonists, come around. There's going to be some compromising as well, but it's not going to do any good. The harsher the consequences, the more significant the resistance becomes, ultimately ending in a wartime policy being implemented by the British. Okay? Now, these early English acts, they were mostly acts for raising money. So, for instance, the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act are the first major acts. And the Sugar Act, well, in fact, the funny thing about the Sugar Act is the Sugar Act didn't, in fact, raise taxes. The Sugar Act actually lowered taxes, which is interesting to think of. But what the Sugar Act did is it actually increased the enforcement. There were high taxes on sugar products in the colonies, but nobody enforced them. So nobody paid them. So if you're going to have a tax that nobody pays, it's not a tax. But now the British is going to say, no, we're going to actually start to enforce this. We want our money. And that's going to be a problem. The Stamp Act is another one. The Stamp Act is an act in which, for certain legal documents, it had to be put on paper that had a stamp much like this one here. The stamp would be embossed in the paper. So if you wanted to write a will, or if you wanted to write a land contract, or you wanted to negotiate any kind of a trade agreement, it would have to be done on paper that was stamped. Of course, these stamps are going to end up on more, paper products than just legal documents, all playing cards, dice packages, things along those lines. And whenever you had to purchase this paper, you were paying this tax, which of course raises the cost of contract arrangements and things along those lines. Well, the American colonists were saying, well, wait a minute, you guys really don't have the right to tax us. We are a separate entity. We are doing our own thing. And most importantly, according to the American colonists, and they kind of had a point, we have no representatives in Parliament to represent and speak for our interests. Therefore, you have no right to tax us. Well, the colonists have a point. They don't have any representation in Parliament. On the other hand, Parliament is saying, well, wait a minute, we paid for this war. We're stationing troops in your land. Somebody has to pay that. And of course, the colonists were coming in and saying, yeah, but you drew a big line. We didn't get anything from this war. So thanks for paying for something we didn't even get. So that really isn't an argument that we're really going to accept. Well, ultimately, Parliament simply solved the problem. And they said, well, look, we're simply going to pass a law that says it doesn't matter if we represent you or not. That, in fact, all British subjects, including the British subjects in North America, are represented in Parliament through what they refer to as virtual representation. Yes, you don't actually have any representatives in Parliament that live where you are, but since you are British subjects and the parliamentarians, the ministers of Parliament, are also British subjects and British leaders, then you are, by virtue of their Britishness, represented virtually. This has nothing to do with the internet. It simply had to do with the fact that there wasn't an actual body there who was a representative. You were represented idealistically, I guess you would say. And the American colonists went, yeah, bullpucky. We want real representation. We want actual representation. We want somebody who is actually from our lands. That actually would have been a really bad idea for the colonists when you really stop and think about it, because if the colonists had been represented in Parliament, they would have lost all of these votes, and they still would have ended up having to pay the taxes. They just wouldn't have been able to complain that they weren't represented. Ultimately, the colonists are going to resist. They are going to put into effect what they call non-importation agreements and non-importation movements. They simply weren't going to purchase sugar. They simply weren't going to purchase that paper that had the stamp, and they were going to not purchase British goods that were being imported into the colonies. Well, this is going to become a real problem, and there's a lot of fighting. And at the time, Britain wasn't a particularly stable place to begin with, so the new Prime Minister comes in. His name was Townsend, and he gets rid of the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, but he implements what is called the Townshend Revenue Act. And the Townshend Revenue Act has to do with, they put an import duty on things like glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. this staple drink of the British colonies. Everybody drank tea. Well, wait a minute. Now we have a problem. So this is where it's going to get kind of ugly. All right, so you don't want to pay these taxes? Well, that's fine. We'll get rid of those taxes. We're going to put in some new taxes, and you don't get the stuff until you pay the taxes. So let's see how this works out. Well, this infuriates the colonists. Now, you're not doing us any favors. Right? This absolutely infuriates the colonists, and they start to organize resistance. And one of our main organizers was this fellow here. You are perhaps familiar with him. His name is Samuel Adams. Not the beer, but rather the man. My board is skewed. I can't write right. Anyway, some of these organizations were, for instance, the Loyal Nine. Probably the most famous of these resistance organizations was the Sons of Liberty. There was also a Daughters of Liberty. That was a female version of the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were famous for erecting liberty poles throughout the colonies to show their resistance to these British taxes. And also, something that the colonies started to do is put together what were called committees of correspondence. These committees of correspondence were pamphlets and letters that were sent and distributed throughout the colonies so that all of the colonies could learn what was going on throughout the colonies and be on the same page with how each colony was resisting these brutal, let's face it, they weren't all that brutal, they were just taxes. But these brutal and tyrannical British policies. Among our chief pamphleteers was our friend, Samuel Adams here, but there were many others who became very famous writers during this time. So he's a major player. Among his contributions was the circular letters that would travel around the colonies, oftentimes with pseudonyms. That would speak venom and fire toward what the British were doing and incite people to act and to boycott British goods. Also, just organizing protests, and some of these protests got pretty nasty. There was rock throwing. People were going to the houses of their governors if their governors were trying to enforce these laws, and raid the houses and commit acts of vandalism. So some of these protests were not your peaceful protests. These were some pretty hotly contested protests. One of the tools that was used during this time was something called tarring and feathering. So typically, people would be hired. If you have a tax, you have to have people who are going to collect that tax, the tax collectors. And these people would be, they would go to collect the taxes, and they would say, "Hey, I'm the tax man. You have to pay your revenues." And whoever it was that was supposed to pay the revenue would go, "Oh yeah? Unfortunately for you, I happen to have a bag of feathers and a bag of pine pitch, and this is really going to be a very bad day for you." So they would take the tax collector and they would tackle him, and they would pour this hot pine pitch on them and then cover them with feathers. In this case, this is a representation of one of these tarring and featherings. Again, this is a document. I want to take a look at it, and I want to go right to the source. And this is a source called the Bostonians Paying the Excise Man, or Tarring and Feathering. This is a print by an English printer by the name of Philip Daw in 1774. And his depiction is actually of an actual tarring and feathering. The fellow here was a loyalist tax collector by the name of John Malcolm. And here we see John Malcolm. He's already been feathered, and in this case, the protesters here are pouring tea down his mouth. So that's definitely in protest of this tea tax. Now, this is, of course, in the back. Oh, whoa! I want my magic pen back. Hold on. I get my magic pen back. All right. So you can kind of see here the famous Liberty Tree. That became a symbol of of these protests. We can move. We can move this and take a look at the. We have a noose hanging ominously in the background. Also, too, take a look in the background here. This is interesting. In the background, we see this is actually a depiction of the Boston Tea Party, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Well, wait a minute. No, wait. That can't be right. The Boston Tea Party happened way before this particular event. They did not actually happen at the same time. And here the artist is kind of giving you an impression that these are, characteristic of the same protest movement. And he was largely correct. The Boston Massacre. All right, so what ends up happening is people are just getting really uptight about this whole thing, and we're starting to protest. We're really starting to have some problems here. People are gathering in the streets. This was a cold winter day in Boston, and people were gathered. They were throwing rocks, throwing snowballs. There were British regulars that were sent in to kind of control the crowd. People were pelting them with snowballs and things like that. And for some reason, we don't know exactly why, because all of the witnesses admit that nobody gave an order to fire into the crowd. But what ended up happening is a musket went off. Boom, fires off, and the regulars panic, and they start firing into the crowd. 7 people are killed, including one Crispus Attucks. He's considered to be the very first death of the American Revolution. Crispus Attucks was a mixed race man, half black, half Native American. And this is a very interesting depiction of this. Now take a look at this. Before we look at the picture, let's take a look at our source. This is a depiction of the Boston Massacre by J.H. Buford, 1850. Oh, wait, hold on, 1850. Look at that. All right, so, well, wait a minute. What's going on in 1850 that might influence this person's depiction of the Boston Massacre? Well, let's take a look here. Of course, who is center stage of this image? Right, Crispus Attucks is the central person here. So what was going on in 1850? And as we know, 1850 was the height of the slavery debate. So this is actually a rendition or a version of the Boston Massacre put together by an abolitionist who was making a point about the status of black people in the United States in 1850, but he's drawing on the American Revolutionary experience, and this is very common in American protests, hearkening back to the original protests that created our country. Ultimately, probably the iconic moment of the pre-revolution resistance movement was the Boston Tea Party, and in essence, what was going on during this time is American colonials were simply flat out refusing to buy tea. They refused to do it. They weren't having it, and they were boycotting tea. Well, this was a real problem for the East India Company, whose primary export was tea. And here was a huge chunk of people who were simply not going to purchase tea, and that means that the value of their tea decreases. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not selling any more tea anywhere else. It simply means that if they invested in this company, thinking that the tea was going to be valued here, and it's valued here, they're losing their investments. So the East India Company has a problem with this, and of course the government is propping these industries up, and the Parliament is going to have to act. So what Parliament actually decides to do, interestingly enough, they try to de-escalate the situation. They actually keep the tea tax in place, but they actually lower the price of the tea to try to induce people to buy the tea so that they end up paying the tax, and they end up getting money, and we can start raising the value of the tea again, and everybody's happy. The colonists have lower prices on the tea, the East India Company is making its profits, and the government is getting its tax revenue. It seems like a pretty good compromise, except American colonists are like, we see what you're trying to do, you sneaky little Jimmy. We see what you're trying to do. You're trying to get us to pay a tax we don't want to pay. You're trying to trick us. We're not going to fall for it. Not us. So the Americans continue to not pay the tax. And in fact, at one point, a group from the Sons of Liberty are going to dress up as Indians, storm onto the ships in the Port Boston Harbor. Now, this was an issue. These ships had come into the Boston Harbor loaded with tea, and the citizens of Boston would not allow the tea to be unloaded. But the governor, the governor of Boston, a guy by the name of Hutchinson, said, "Oh yeah, well, we're not going to let the ships leave until these ships are unloaded." The captains of the ships came in and they were saying, "Hey, look, we're stuck. We're not allowed to leave. We're not allowed to unload. You got to help us out." So the Sons of Liberty decided to help them out. They dressed up as Indians. They stormed the ships. They smashed open the crates, and they dumped the tea into Boston Harbor. Approximately 45 tons of tea that they dumped into the Boston Harbor. Boston Harbor was referred to as a teapot as a result of this. Ultimately cost the East India Company approximately 10,000 pounds, which was no small piece of change for that particular time. So that's it. All right, we just you dump this tea. You can't do that. You can't just arbitrarily dump people's profits into your Boston Harbor. So the Parliament is going to enact something that they called the Coercive Acts. We are going to make the colonists pay their taxes. We're going to make them obedient to the will of the Parliament, and we are going to make them pay back the East India Company every dime that they dumped into the Boston Harbor. So they put into effect these intolerable acts, and these intolerable acts were a number of different acts that were designed to punish the colonists. You got to understand, there was agitation going on in England at this time. There were food riots, there were labor strikes and labor unrest. There was a lot of dissension going on in England, and many of the folks who were in the middle of the protest in England, what were referred to as Whigs, were very sympathetic to the American cause. This is an example. This is a great example of a work of somebody in England who was sympathetic, to the American cause. And in this case, we have John Bull, the image of Britain, on top of and holding and pinning down a Native American woman who is drawn to represent the United States, not the United States, but the British colonies. And of course, he's dumping tea down the throat, but it's not actually tea, it's the intolerable acts down the throats of the American colonists. Now this looks an awful, this seems to harken back to that tarring and feathering picture that we just saw earlier. Either way, these coercive acts were known in the American colonies as the intolerable acts. These acts are intolerable, and they were pretty punitive. For instance, the Boston Port Bill put in and said, "Oh yeah, you guys want to dump stuff in the harbor? Good for you. But you know what? Not one more thing is going to be unloaded in Boston Harbor until you pay back damages." So basically, Boston wasn't going to get any imports anymore as a result of this Boston Port Act until it paid up its bills. Another thing that they did was Parliament simply outlawed the Massachusetts government. They said, "No more. From now on, there's going to be, your charter has been revoked. There's going to be a governor appointed by the king overseeing the colonies. Your parliament, your legislature, which was at one time elected by the propertied males of Massachusetts, your elected legislature no longer exists. Your legislature will be appointed by the king. And your town hall meetings, you can hold one a year. No more. We're not going to let you get together and plan any more skullduggery on the English expense. So, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act said, hey, look, you know what? Those soldiers who had been defended, or those soldiers who had fired into the crowd in Boston, they don't have to be tried in a colonial court. They must be tried in a British court. By the way, those soldiers had been very aptly defended by none other than John Adams, who will become our second president, a great patriot during the American Revolution. So this was known as the Administration of Justice Act. The British also said, hey, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put soldiers in your towns, and they're going to be able to sleep wherever they want. So they can come into your businesses, they can come into your homes, and you have to provide them a place to stay, a place to live, whether you want to or not. This was known as the Quartering Act. They also put into effect something that was called the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act established a second centralized form of government over the former French possessions of the British colonies in Quebec. This government was an authoritarian government. It was a legislative government. It was also a Roman Catholic government. And this was put into effect, and this deeply concerned the colonists, because the American colonists believed that the English were going to either try to take them over from the West, or they were going to be replaced by the Western colonies, a more complacent Western colonies. And the American response to this, as you can probably well imagine, was not good. This is where we actually see the colonies are going to now come together in defense of Massachusetts, which is actually pretty nice. In what was called the First Continental Congress, the first Congress representing all of the colonies together, making decisions for all of the colonies together. It is what Benjamin Franklin was talking about, the Albany Plan, back in Lecture 9, before the French and Indian War. Now, more than 10, actually probably closer to 15 years later, we're seeing it put into effect with the First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress is going to actually, start to organize resistance, start to raise militia, and start to figure out how are we going to deal with and make Britain, see things our way. How are we going to get what we want out of this? And we don't want to have to go through all of this stuff. The First Continental Congress was not initially established to say we are an independent country. The First Continental Congress was rather established to try to organize resistance against the British, but ultimately to try to solve these British problems, these problems that they were having with their country. They still saw themselves as British subjects, but not quite. Right? But things are ultimately going to come to a head in Massachusetts, in what will become known as the Battle of Lexington and Concord. What was happening during this time is the British Crown, the representatives of the Crown discovered, the royal governor discovered that the Americans were hoarding weapons for the sake of defending themselves against the British forces. So they realized that in the city of Concord, there was a big stash, there was a big armory of weapons that the local militia were going to use. Now these militia were known as Minutemen. The idea behind the Minutemen is that when the alarm sounds, the Minutemen will be prepared to fight within 1 minute. Maybe a bit of a stretch, but that's the idea is that they're going to come together really, really fast and be able to defend their towns, their villages. So, well, the British said, well, that's fine. We are simply going to go to Concord, and we are going to take those weapons. We're going to get those weapons, and we're going to take them. There was also an idea that we're going to find a leader of the revolution, a fellow by the name of John Hancock, and we are going to arrest them. Well, what ends up happening is the word gets around to some resistors, two of whom were Paul Revere and William Dawes. Their job was to make sure that everybody knew what was going on. Their job was to alert the countryside for the contingency of the British coming after them. So they start riding off toward Concord, yelling, of course, that the British are coming, the British are coming. Paul Revere is famous for this as a result of the poem in his name. Ironically, Paul Revere didn't get very far. He ends up getting arrested by the British. It was actually William Dawes who actually completed the task. But either way, as British soldiers were working their way to Concord, the American countryside had been riled up, and a militia had gathered in Lexington to stop the British from moving on. But they had just been thrown together. They were nervous. They were scared, and they were gathering their guns. And the regulars in Lexington formed formations. They were very disciplined soldiers, and they fired. They told the militia to drop their guns. The militia realized they were not ready to fight, and they left the field. But they refused to drop their guns. They did not drop their guns. They left the field. The British got really angry about that. They're supposed to. This is the rule. You have to drop your gun. We're not going to do that. We will go away, but we're not going to do that. The British finally start making their way to Concord. And by the time they get to Concord, the militia there had time to gather itself and to organize itself into a useful resistance, and they fired on the British. And the British fired back. In fact, there were more colonial casualties than there were British casualties. But the British realized, whoa, wait a minute, we're kind of in a bad situation here. So the British military turned around, went back down the road, and what did they encounter? Well, all those militiamen who had turned away in Concord were waiting for them on their way back. And the British ended up having to fight their way back to Boston in order to get away. I believe it was something like 75 British soldiers were lost during this fight. Either way, it is now clear that the American colonies are now at war with the nation of Britain.